Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 10. The Active Side of Infinity. Who was Juan Matus, really? The part of my account of meeting Don Juan that he didn't want to hear about was my feelings and impressions on that fateful day when I walked into his house. The contradictory clash between my expectations and the reality of the situation, and the effect that was caused in me by a cluster of the most extravagant ideas I had ever heard. That is more in the line of confession than in the line of events, he had said to me once when I tried to tell him about all this. You couldn't be more wrong, Don Juan, I began, but I stopped. Something in the way he looked at me made me realize that he was right. Whatever I was going to say could have sounded only like lip service, flattery. What had taken place on our first real meeting, however, was of transcendental importance to me, an event of ultimate consequence. During my first encounter with Don Juan, in the bus depot in Nogales, Arizona, something of an unusual nature had happened to me, but it had come to me cushioned in my concerns with the presentation of the self. I had wanted to impress Don Juan, and in attempting to do so I had focused all my attention on the act of selling my wares, so to speak. It was only months later that a strange residue of forgotten events began to appear. One day, out of nowhere, and with no coaxing or coaching on my part, I recollected with extraordinary clarity something that had completely bypassed me during my actual encounter with Don Juan. When he had stopped me from telling him my name, he had peered into my eyes and had numbed me with his look. There was infinitely more that I could have said to him about myself. I could have expounded on my knowledge and worth for hours if his look hadn't completely cut me off. In light of this new realization, I reconsidered everything that had happened to me on that occasion. My unavoidable conclusion was that I had experienced the interruption of some mysterious flow that kept me going, a flow that had never been interrupted before, at least not in the manner in which Don Juan had done it. When I tried to describe to any of my friends what I had physically experienced, a strange perspiration began to cover my entire body, the same perspiration that I had experienced when Don Juan had given me that look. I had been, at that moment, not only incapable of voicing a single word, but incapable of having a single thought. For some time after, I dwelled on the physical sensation of this interruption, for which I found no rational explanation. I argued for a while that Don Juan must have hypnotized me, but then my memory told me that he hadn't given any hypnotic commands, nor had he made any movements that could have trapped my attention. In fact, he had merely glanced at me. It was the intensity of that glance that had made it appear as if he had stared at me for a long time. It had obsessed me and had rendered me discombobulated at a deep physical level. When I finally had Don Juan in front of me again, the first thing I noticed about him was that he didn't look at all as I had imagined him during all the time I had tried to find him. I had fabricated an image of the man I had met at the bus depot, which I perfected every day by allegedly remembering more details. In my mind, he was an old man, still very strong and nimble, yet almost frail. The man facing me was muscular and decisive. He moved with agility, but not nimbleness. His steps were firm and, at the same time, light. He exuded vitality and purpose. My composite memory was not at all in harmony with the real thing. I thought he had short, white hair and an extremely dark complexion. His hair was longer and not as white as I had imagined. His complexion was not that dark either. I could have sworn that his features were bird-like because of his age. But that was not so either. His face was full, almost round. In one glance, the most outstanding feature of the man looking at me was his dark eyes, which shone with a peculiar, dancing glow. Something that had bypassed me completely in my prior assessment of him was the fact that his total countenance was that of an athlete. His shoulders were broad, his stomach flat. He seemed to be planted firmly on the ground. There was no feebleness to his knees, no tremor in his upper limbs. I had imagined detecting a slight tremor in his head and arms, as if he were nervous and unsteady. I had also imagined him to be about 5 feet 6 inches tall, 3 inches shorter than his actual height. Don Juan didn't seem surprised to see me. I wanted to tell him how difficult it had been for me to find him. I would have liked to be congratulated by him on my titanic efforts, but he just laughed at me, teasingly. "Your efforts are not important," he said. "What's important is that you found my place. Sit down," he said, enticing me, pointing to one of the freight boxes under his ramada and patting me on my back, but it wasn't a friendly pat. It felt like he had slapped me on the back, although he never actually touched me. His quasi-slap created a strange, unstable sensation, which appeared abruptly and disappeared before I had time to grasp what it was. What was left in me instead was a strange peace. I felt at ease. My mind was crystal clear. I had no expectations, no desires. My usual nervousness and sweaty hands, the marks of my existence, were suddenly gone. "Now you will understand everything I am going to say to you," Don Juan said to me, looking into my eyes as he had done in the bus depot. Ordinarily, I would have found his statement perfunctory, perhaps rhetorical, but when he said it, I could only assure him repeatedly and sincerely that I would understand anything he said to me. He looked me in the eyes again with a ferocious intensity. "I am Juan Matus," he said, sitting down on another freight box, a few feet away, facing me. "This is my name, and I voice it because with it, I am making a bridge for you to cross over to where I am." He stared at me for an instant before he started talking again. "I am a sorcerer," he went on. "I belong to a lineage of sorcerers that has lasted for 27 generations. I am the Nagual of my generation." He explained to me that the leader of a party of sorcerers like himself was called the Nagual, and that this was a generic term applied to a sorcerer in each generation who had some specific energetic configuration that set him apart from the others. Not in terms of superiority or inferiority or anything of the like, but in terms of the capacity to be responsible. Only the Nagual, he said, has the energetic capacity to be responsible for the fate of his cohorts. Every one of his cohorts knows this, and they exceed. The Nagual can be a man or a woman. In the time of the sorcerers who were the founders of my lineage, women were, by rule, the Naguals. Their natural pragmatism, the product of their femaleness, led my lineage into pits of practicalities from which they could barely emerge. Then, the males took over and led my lineage into pits of imbecility from which we are barely emerging now. Since the time of the Nagual Luyan, who lived about 200 years ago, he went on, there has been a joint nexus of effort, shared by a man and a woman. The Nagual man brings sobriety, the Nagual woman brings innovation. I wanted to ask him at this point if there was a woman in his life who was the Nagual, but the depth of my concentration didn't allow me to formulate the question. Instead, he himself formulated it for me. "Is there a Nagual woman in my life?" he asked. "No, there isn't any. I am a solitary sorcerer. I have my cohorts, though. At the moment, they are not around." The thought came with uncontainable vigor into my mind. At that instant, I remembered what some people in Yuma had told me about Don Juan running with a party of Mexican men who seemed to be very versed in sorcery maneuvers. To be a sorcerer, Don Juan continued, doesn't mean to practice witchcraft, or to work to affect people, or to be possessed by demons. To be a sorcerer means to reach a level of awareness that makes inconceivable things available. The term sorcery is inadequate to express what sorcerers do, and so is the term shamanism. The actions of sorcerers are exclusively in the realm of the abstract, the impersonal. Sorcerers struggle to reach a goal that has nothing to do with the quests of an average man. Sorcerers' aspirations are to reach infinity and to be conscious of it. Don Juan continued, saying that the task of sorcerers was to face infinity and that they plunged into it daily, as a fisherman plunges into the sea. It was such an overwhelming task that sorcerers had to state their names before venturing into it. He reminded me that, in Nogales, he had stated his name before any interaction had taken place between us. He had, in this manner, asserted his individuality in front of the infinite. I understood with unequaled clarity what he was explaining. I didn't have to ask him for clarifications. My keenness of thought should have surprised me, but it didn't at all. I knew at that moment that I had always been crystal clear, merely playing dumb for someone else's benefit. "Without you knowing anything about it," he continued, "I started you on a traditional quest. You are the man I was looking for. My quest ended when I found you, and yours when you found me now." Don Juan explained to me that, as the Nagual of his generation, he was in search of an individual who had a specific energetic configuration, adequate to ensure the continuity of his lineage. He said that at a given moment, the Nagual of each generation for 27 successive generations had entered into the most nerve-wracking experience of their lives: the search for succession. Looking me straight in the eyes, he stated that what made human beings into sorcerers was their capacity to perceive energy directly as it flows in the universe, and that when sorcerers perceive a human being in this fashion, they see a luminous ball or a luminous egg-shaped figure. His contention was that human beings are not only capable of seeing energy directly as it flows in the universe, but that they actually do see it, although they are not deliberately conscious of seeing it. He made right then the most crucial distinction for sorcerers, the one between the general state of being aware and the particular state of being deliberately conscious of something. He categorized all human beings as possessing awareness, in a general sense, which permits them to see energy directly, and he categorized sorcerers as the only human beings who were deliberately conscious of seeing energy directly. He then defined awareness as energy and energy as constant flux, a luminous vibration that was never stationary, but always moving of its own accord. He asserted that when a human being was seen, he was perceived as a conglomerate of energy fields, held together by the most mysterious force in the universe. A binding, agglutinating, vibratory force that holds energy fields together in a cohesive unit. He further explained that the Nagual was a specific sorcerer in each generation, whom the other sorcerers were able to see, not as a single luminous ball, but as a set of two spheres of luminosity fused, one over the other. This feature of doubleness, he continued, permits the Nagual to perform maneuvers that are rather difficult for an average sorcerer. For example, the Nagual is a connoisseur of the force that holds us together as a cohesive unit. The Nagual could place his full attention, for a fraction of a second, on that force and numb the other person. I did that to you at the bus depot because I wanted to stop your barrage of me. I wanted you to find me and cut the crap. The sorcerers of my lineage maintained, Don Juan went on, that the presence of a double being in Nagual is sufficient to clarify things for us. What's odd about it is that the presence of the Nagual clarifies things in a veiled fashion. It happened to me when I met the Nagual Julian, my teacher. His presence baffled me for years, because every time I was around him, I could think clearly, but when he moved away, I became the same idiot that I had always been. I had the privilege, Don Juan went on, of actually meeting and dealing with two Naguals. For 6 years, at the request of the Nagual Elias, the teacher of the Nagual Julian, I went to live with him. He is the one who reared me, so to speak. It was a rare privilege. I had a ringside seat for watching what a Nagual really is. The Nagual Elias and the Nagual Julian were two men of tremendously different temperaments. The Nagual Elias was quieter and lost in the darkness of his silence. The Nagual Julian was bombastic, a compulsive talker. It seemed that he lived to dazzle women. There were more women in his life than one would care to think about. Yet both of them were astoundingly alike in that there was nothing inside them. They were empty. The Nagual Elias was a collection of astounding, haunting stories of regions unknown. The Nagual Julian was a collection of stories that would have anybody in stitches, sprawled on the ground laughing. Whenever I tried to pin down the man in them, the real man, the way I could pinpoint the man in my father, the man in everybody I knew, I found nothing. Instead of a real person inside them, there was a bunch of stories about persons unknown. Each of the two men had his own flair, but the end result was just the same. Emptiness, an emptiness that reflected not the world, but infinity. Don Juan went on explaining that the moment one crosses a peculiar threshold in infinity, either deliberately or, as in my case, unwittingly, everything that happens to one from then on is no longer exclusively in one's own domain, but enters into the realm of infinity. When we met in Arizona, both of us crossed a peculiar threshold, he continued. And this threshold was not decided by either one of us, but by infinity itself. Infinity is everything that surrounds us. He said this and made a broad gesture with his arms. The sorcerers of my lineage call it infinity, the spirit, the dark sea of awareness, and say that it is something that exists out there and rules our lives. I was truly capable of comprehending everything he was saying, and yet I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. I asked if crossing the threshold had been an accidental event, born of unpredictable circumstances ruled by chance. He answered that his steps and mine were guided by infinity, and that circumstances that seemed to be ruled by chance were in essence ruled by the active side of infinity. He called it intent. What put you and me together, he went on, was the intent of infinity. It is impossible to determine what this intent of infinity is, yet it is there, as palpable as you and I are. Sorcerers say that it is a tremor in the air. The advantage of sorcerers is to know that the tremor in the air exists and to acquiesce to it without any further ado. For sorcerers, there's no pondering, wondering, or speculating. They know that all they have is the possibility of merging with the intent of infinity, and they just do it. Nothing could have been clearer to me than those statements. As far as I was concerned, the truth of what he was telling me was so self-evident that it didn't permit me to ponder how such absurd assertions could have sounded so rational. I knew that everything that Don Juan was saying was not only a truism, but I could corroborate it by referring to my own being. I knew about everything that he was saying. I had the sensation that I had lived every twist of his description. Our interchange ended then. Something seemed to deflate inside me. It was at that instant that the thought crossed my mind that I was losing my marbles. I had been blinded by weird statements and had lost every conceivable sense of objectivity. Accordingly, I left Don Juan's house in a real hurry, feeling threatened to the core by an unseen enemy. Don Juan walked me to my car, fully cognizant of what was going on inside me. "Don't worry," he said, putting his hand on my shoulder. "You're not going crazy." What you felt was a gentle tap of infinity. As time went by, I was able to corroborate what Don Juan had said about his two teachers. Don Juan Matus was exactly as he had described those two men to be. I would go as far as saying that he was an extraordinary blend of both of them. On the one hand, extremely quiet and introspective, on the other, extremely open and funny. The most accurate statement about what a nagual is, which he voiced the day I found him, was that a nagual is empty, and that emptiness doesn't reflect the world, but reflects infinity. Nothing could have been more true than this in reference to Don Juan Matus. His emptiness reflected infinity. There was no boisterousness on his part or assertions about the self. There was not a speck of a need to have either grievances or remorse. His was the emptiness of a warrior traveler, seasoned to the point where he doesn't take anything for granted. A warrior traveler who doesn't underestimate or overestimate anything. A quiet, disciplined fighter whose elegance is so extreme that no one, no matter how hard they try to look, will ever find the seam where all that complexity has come together. The deep concerns of everyday life. I went to Sonora to see Don Juan. I had to discuss with him the most serious event of that moment in my life. I needed his advice. When I arrived at his house, I barely went through the formality of greeting him. I sat down and blurted out my turmoil. Calm down, Don Juan said. "Nothing can be that bad." "What's happening to me, Don Juan?" I asked. It was a rhetorical question on my part. "It is the workings of infinity," he replied. "Something happened to your way of perceiving the day you met me. Your sensation of nervousness is due to the subliminal realization that your time is up. You are aware of it, but not deliberately conscious of it. You feel the absence of time, and that makes you impatient. I know this, for it happened to me and to all the sorcerers of my lineage. At a given time, a whole era in my life, or their lives, ended. Now it's your turn. You have simply run out of time." He demanded then a total account of whatever had happened to me. He said that it had to be a full account, sparing no details. He wasn't after sketchy descriptions. He wanted me to air the full impact of what was troubling me. "Let's have this talk, as they say in your world, by the book," he said. Let us enter into the realm of formal talks. Don Juan explained that the shamans of ancient Mexico had developed the idea of formal versus informal talks and used both of them as devices for teaching and guiding their disciples. Formal talks were, for them, summations that they made from time to time of everything that they had taught or said to their disciples. Informal talks were daily elucidations in which things were explained without reference to anything but the phenomenon itself under scrutiny. Sorcerers keep nothing to themselves, he continued. To empty themselves in this fashion is a sorcerer's maneuver. It leads them to abandon the fortress of the self. I began my story, telling Don Juan that the circumstances of my life have never permitted me to be introspective. As far back in my past as I can remember, my daily life has been filled to the brim with pragmatic problems that have clamored for immediate resolution. I remember my favorite uncle telling me that he was appalled at having found out that I had never received a gift for Christmas or for my birthday. I had come to live in my father's family's home not too long before he made that statement. He commiserated with me about the unfairness of my situation. He even apologized, although it had nothing to do with him. It is disgusting, my boy, he said, shaking with feeling. I want you to know that I am behind you 100% whenever the moment comes to redress wrongdoings. He insisted over and over that I had to forgive the people who had wronged me. From what he said, I formed the impression that he wanted me to confront my father with his finding and accuse him of indolence and neglect, and then, of course, forgive him. He failed to see that I didn't feel wronged at all. What he was asking me to do required an introspective nature that would make me respond to the barbs of psychological mistreatment once they were pointed out to me. I assured my uncle that I was going to think about it, but not at the moment, because at that very instant, my girlfriend, from the living room where she was waiting for me, was signaling me desperately to hurry up. I never had the opportunity to think about it, but my uncle must have talked to my father, because I got a gift from him, a package neatly wrapped up, with ribbon and all, and a little card that said sorry. I curiously and eagerly ripped the wrappings. There was a cardboard box, and inside it there was a beautiful toy, a tiny boat with a winding key attached to the steam pipe. It could be used by children to play with while they took baths in the bathtub. My father had thoroughly forgotten that I was already 15 years old and, for all practical purposes, a man. Since I had reached my adult years still incapable of serious introspection, it was quite a novelty when one day years later I found myself in the throes of a strange emotional agitation, which seemed to increase as time went by. I discarded it, attributing it to natural processes of the mind or the body that enter into action periodically, for no reason at all, or are perhaps triggered by biochemical processes within the body itself. I thought nothing of it. However, the agitation increased, and its pressure forced me to believe that I had arrived at a moment in life when what I needed was a drastic change. There was something in me that demanded a rearrangement of my life. This urge to rearrange everything was familiar. I had felt it in the past, but it had been dormant for a long time. I was committed to studying anthropology, and this commitment was so strong that not to study anthropology was never part of my proposed drastic change. It didn't occur to me to drop out of school and do something else. The first thing that came to mind was that I needed to change schools and go somewhere else, far away from Los Angeles. Before I undertook a change of that magnitude, I wanted to test the waters, so to speak. I enrolled in a full summer load of classes at a school in another city. The most important course for me was a class in anthropology taught by a foremost authority on the Indians of the Andean region. It was my belief that if I focused my studies on an area that was emotionally accessible to me, I would have a better opportunity to do anthropological field work in a serious manner when the time came. I conceived of Renai knowledge of South America as giving me a better entree into any given Indian society there. At the same time that I registered for school, I got a job as a research assistant to a psychiatrist who was the older brother of one of my friends. He wanted to do a content analysis of excerpts from some innocuous tapes of question and answer sessions with young men and women about their problems arising from overwork in school, unfulfilled expectations, not being understood at home, frustrating love affairs, etc. The tapes were over 5 years old and were going to be destroyed, but before they were, random numbers were allotted to each reel, and following a table of random numbers, reels were picked by the psychiatrist and his research assistants and scanned for excerpts that could be analyzed. On the first day of class in the new school, the anthropology professor talked about his academic bona fides and dazzled his students with the scope of his knowledge and his publications. He was a tall, slender man in his mid-40s, with shifty blue eyes. What struck me the most about his physical appearance was that his eyes were rendered enormous behind glasses for correcting far-sightedness, and each of his eyes gave the impression that it was rotating in an opposite direction from the other when he moved his head as he spoke. I knew that couldn't be true. It was, however, a very disconcerting image. He was extremely well dressed for an anthropologist, who in my day were famous for their super casual attire. Archaeologists, for example, were described by their students as creatures lost in carbon I-4 dating who never took a bath. However, for reasons unbeknownst to me, what really set him apart wasn't his physical appearance or his erudition, but his speech pattern. He pronounced every word as clearly as anyone I had ever heard and emphasized certain words by elongating them. He had a markedly foreign intonation, but I knew that it was an affectation. He pronounced certain phrases like an Englishman and others like a revivalist preacher. He fascinated me from the start despite his enormous pomposity. His self-importance was so blatant that it ceased to be an issue after the first 5 minutes of his class, which were always bombastic displays of knowledge cushioned in wild assertions about himself. His command of the audience was sensational. None of the students I talked to felt anything but supreme admiration for this extraordinary man. I earnestly thought that everything was moving along nicely, and that this move to another school in another city was going to be easy and uneventful, but thoroughly positive. I liked my new surroundings. At my job, I became completely engrossed in listening to the tapes, to the point where I would sneak into the office and listen not to excerpts, but to entire tapes. What fascinated me beyond measure, at first, was the fact that I heard myself speaking in every one of those tapes. As the weeks went by and I heard more tapes, my fascination turned to sheer horror. Every line that was spoken, including the psychiatrist's questions, was mine. Those people were speaking from the depths of my own being. The revulsion that I experienced was something unique for me. Never had I dreamed that I could be repeated endlessly in every man or woman I heard speaking on the tapes. My sense of individuality, which had been ingrained in me from birth, tumbled down hopelessly under the impact of this colossal discovery. I began then an odious process of trying to restore myself. I unconsciously made a ludicrous attempt at introspection. I tried to wriggle out of my predicament by endlessly talking to myself. I rehashed in my mind all the possible rationales that would support my sense of uniqueness, and then talked out loud to myself about them. I even experienced something quite revolutionary to me. Waking myself up many times by my loud talking in my sleep, discoursing about my value and distinctiveness. Then, one horrifying day, I suffered another deadly blow. In the wee hours of the night, I was woken up by an insistent knocking on my door. It wasn't a mild, timid knock, but what my friends called a Gestapo knock. The door was about to come off its hinges. I jumped out of bed and opened the peephole. The person who was knocking on the door was my boss, the psychiatrist. My being his younger brother's friend seemed to have created an avenue of communication with him. He had befriended me without any hesitation, and there he was on my doorstep. I turned on the light and opened the door. "Please come in," I said. "What happened?" It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and by his livid expression and his sunken eyes, I knew that he was deeply upset. He came in and sat down. His pride and joy, his black mane of longish hair, was falling all over his face. He didn't make any effort to comb his hair back the way he usually wore it. I liked him very much because he was an older version of my friend in Los Angeles, with black, heavy eyebrows, penetrating brown eyes, a square jaw, and thick lips. His upper lip seemed to have an extra fold inside, which at times, when he smiled in a certain way, gave the impression that he had a double upper lip. He always talked about the shape of his nose, which he described as an impertinent, pushy nose. I thought he was extremely sure of himself and opinionated beyond belief. He claimed that in his profession those qualities were winning cards. "What happened?" he repeated with a tone of mockery, his double upper lip trembling uncontrollably. "Anyone can tell that everything has happened to me tonight." He sat down in a chair. He seemed dizzy, disoriented, looking for words. He got up and went to the couch, slumping down on it. "It's not only that I have the responsibility of my patients," he went on, "but my research grant, my wife and kids, and now another fucking pressure has been added to it, and what burns me up is that it was my own fault, my own stupidity for putting my trust in a stupid cunt. I'll tell you, Carlos," he continued, "there's nothing more appalling, disgusting, fucking nauseating than the insensitivity of women. I'm not a woman hater, you know that. But at this moment it seems to me that every single cunt is just a cunt. Duplicitous and vile." I didn't know what to say. Whatever he was telling me didn't need affirmation or contradiction. I wouldn't have dared to contradict him anyway. I didn't have the ammunition for it. I was very tired. I wanted to go back to sleep, but he kept on talking as if his life depended on it. "You know Teresa Manning, don't you?" he asked me in a forceful, accusatory manner. For an instant, I believed that he was accusing me of having something to do with his young, beautiful student secretary. Without giving me time to respond, he continued talking. "Teresa Manning is an asshole. She's a schnook. A stupid, inconsiderate woman who has no incentive in life other than balling anyone with a bit of fame and notoriety. I thought she was intelligent and sensitive. I thought she had something, some understanding, some empathy, something that one would like to share or hold as precious all to oneself. I don't know, but that's the picture that she painted for me, when in reality she's lewd and degenerate and, I may add, incurably gross. As he kept on talking, a strange picture began to emerge. Apparently, the psychiatrist had just had a bad experience involving his secretary. Since the day she came to work for me, he went on, I knew that she was attracted to me sexually, but she never came around to saying it. It was all in the innuendos and the looks. Well, fuck it. This afternoon I got sick and tired of pussyfooting around, and I came right to the point. I went up to her desk and said, I know what you want, and you know what I want. He went into a great elaborate rendition of how forcefully he had told her that he expected her in his apartment across the street from school at 2:30 p.m. and that he did not alter his routines for anybody, that he read and worked and drank wine until 1 o'clock, at which time he retired to the bedroom. He kept an apartment in town, as well as the house he and his wife and children lived in the suburbs. I was so confident that the affair was going to pan out, turn into something memorable, he said and sighed. His voice acquired the mellow tone of someone confiding something intimate. I even gave her the key to my apartment, he said, and his voice cracked. Very dutifully, she came at 11:30, he went on. She let herself in with her own key and sneaked into the bedroom like a shadow. That excited me terribly. I knew that she wasn't going to be any trouble for me. She knew her role. She probably fell asleep on the bed. Or maybe she watched TV. I became engrossed in my work, and I didn't care what the fuck she did. I knew that I had her in the bag. But the moment I came into the bedroom, he continued, his voice tense and constricted, as if he were morally offended, Teresa jumped on me like an animal and went for my dick. She didn't even give me time to put down the bottle and the 2 glasses I was carrying. I had enough presence of mind to put my 2 baccarat glasses on the floor without breaking them. The bottle flew across the room when she grabbed my balls as if they were made out of rocks. I wanted to hit her. I actually yelled in pain, but that didn't faze her. She giggled insanely because she thought I was being cute and sexy. She said so, as if to placate me. Shaking his head with contained rage, he said that the woman was so friggin' eager and utterly selfish that she didn't take into account that a man needs a moment's peace. He needs to feel at ease, at home, in friendly surroundings. Instead of showing consideration and understanding, as her role demanded, Teresa Manning pulled his sexual organs out of his pants with the expertise of someone who had done it hundreds of times. The result of all this shit, he said, was that my sensuality retreated in horror. I was emotionally emasculated. My body abhorred that fucking woman, instantly. Yet my lust prevented me from throwing her out in the street. He said that he decided then that instead of losing face by his impotence, miserably, the way he was bound to, he would have oral sex with her and make her have an orgasm, put her at his mercy. But his body had rejected the woman so thoroughly that he couldn't do it. The woman was not even beautiful anymore, he said, but plain. Whenever she's dressed up, the clothes that she wears hide the bulges of her hips. She actually looks okay. But when she's naked, she's a sack of bulging white flesh. The slenderness that she presents when she's clothed is fake. It doesn't exist. Venom poured out of the psychiatrist in ways that I would never have imagined. He was shaking with rage. He wanted desperately to appear cool and kept on smoking cigarette after cigarette. He said that the oral sex was even more maddening and disgusting, and that he was just about to vomit when the friggin' woman actually kicked him in the belly, rolled him out of his own bed onto the floor, and called him an impotent faggot. At this point in his narration, the psychiatrist's eyes were burning with hatred. His mouth was quivering. He was pale. "I have to use your bathroom," he said. "I want to take a bath. I am reeking. Believe it or not, I have pussy breath." He was actually weeping, and I would have given anything in the world not to be there. Perhaps it was my fatigue, or the mesmeric quality of his voice, or the inanity of the situation that created the illusion that I was listening not to the psychiatrist, but to the voice of a male supplicant on one of his tapes, complaining about minor problems turned into gigantic affairs by talking obsessively about them. My ordeal ended around 9 o'clock in one morning. It was time for me to go to class and time for the psychiatrist to go and see his own shrink. I went to class then, highly charged with a burning anxiety and a tremendous sensation of discomfort and uselessness. There, I received the final blow, the blow that caused my attempt at a drastic change to collapse. No volition of my own was involved in its collapse, which just happened not only as if it had been scheduled, but as if its progression had been accelerated by some unknown hand. The anthropology professor began his lecture about a group of Indians from the high plateaus of Bolivia and Peru, the Amara. He called them the Aymara, elongating the name, as if his pronunciation of it was the only accurate one in existence. He said that the making of chicha, which is pronounced chi-cha, but which he pronounced chahi-cha, an alcoholic beverage made from fermented corn, was in the realm of a sect of priestesses who were considered semi-divine by the Amara. He said, in a tone of revelation, that those women were in charge of making the cooked corn into a mush, ready for fermentation by chewing and spitting it, adding in this manner an enzyme found in human saliva. The whole class shrieked with contained horror at the mention of human saliva. The professor seemed to be tickled pink. He laughed in little spurts. It was the chuckle of a nasty child. He went on to say that the women were expert chewers, and he called them the chahi-cha chewers. He looked at the front row of the classroom, where most of the young women were sitting, and he delivered his punchline. "I was privileged," he said with a strange quasi-foreign intonation, "to be asked to sleep with one of the chahi-cha chewers. The art of chewing the chahi-cha mush makes them develop the muscles around their throat and cheeks to the point that they can do wonders with them." He looked at his bewildered audience and paused for a long time, punctuating the pause with his giggles. "I'm sure you get my drift," he said, and went into fits of hysterical laughter. The class went wild with the professor's innuendo. The lecture was interrupted by at least 5 minutes of laughter and a barrage of questions that the professor declined to answer, emitting more silly giggles. I felt so compressed by the pressure of the tapes, the psychiatrist's story, and the professor's chahi-cha chewers, that in one instantaneous sweep I quit the job, quit school, and drove back to LA. Whatever happened to me with the psychiatrist and the professor of anthropology, I said to Don Juan, has plunged me into an unknown emotional state. I can only call it introspection. I've been talking to myself without stop. Your malady is a very simple one, Don Juan said, shaking with laughter. Apparently my situation delighted him. It was a delight I could not share, because I failed to see the humor in it. Your world is coming to an end, he said. It is the end of an era for you. Do you think that the world you have known all your life is going to leave you peacefully, without any fuss or muss? No. It will wriggle underneath you and hit you with its tail. The view I could not stand. Los Angeles had always been home for me. My choice of Los Angeles had not been volitional. To me, staying in Los Angeles has always been the equivalent of having been born there, perhaps even more than that. My emotional attachment to it has always been total. My love for the city of Los Angeles has always been so intense, so much a part of me, that I have never had to voice it. I have never had to review it or renew it, ever. I had, in Los Angeles, my family of friends. They were to me part of my immediate milieu, meaning that I had accepted them totally, the way I had accepted the city. One of my friends made the statement once, half in fun, that all of us hated each other cordially. Doubtless, they could afford feelings like that themselves, for they had other emotional arrangements at their disposal, like parents and wives and husbands. I had only my friends in Los Angeles. For whatever reason, I was each one's confidant. Every one of them poured out to me their problems and vicissitudes. My friends were so close to me that I had never acknowledged their problems or tribulations as anything but normal. I could talk for hours to them about the very same things that had horrified me in the psychiatrist and his tapes. Furthermore, I had never realized that every one of my friends was astoundingly similar to the psychiatrist and the professor of anthropology. I had never noticed how tense my friends were. All of them smoked compulsively, like the psychiatrist, but it had never been obvious to me because I smoked just as much myself and was just as tense. Their affectation in speech was another thing that had never been apparent to me, although it was there. They always affected a twang of the Western United States, but they were very aware of what they were doing. Nor had I ever noticed their blatant innuendos about a sensuality that they were incapable of feeling, except intellectually. The real confrontation with myself began when I was faced with the dilemma of my friend Pete. He came to see me, all battered. He had a swollen mouth and a red and swollen left eye that had obviously been hit and was turning blue already. Before I had time to ask him what had happened to him, he blurted out that his wife, Patricia, had gone to a real estate brokers convention over the weekend in relation to her job and that something terrible had happened to her. The way Pete looked, I thought that perhaps Patricia had been injured or even killed in an accident. Is she all right? I asked, genuinely concerned. Of course she's all right, he barked. She's a bitch and a whore. And nothing happens to bitch whores, except that they get fucked, and they like it. Pete was rabid. He was shaking, nearly convulsing. His bushy, curly hair was sticking out every which way. Usually, he combed it carefully and slicked his natural curls into place. Now, he looked as wild as a Tasmanian devil. Everything was normal until today, my friend continued. Then, this morning, after I came out of the shower, she snapped a towel at my naked butt, and that's what made me aware of her shit. I knew instantly that she'd been fucking someone else. I was puzzled by his line of reasoning. I questioned him further. I asked him how snapping a towel could reveal anything of this sort to anybody. It wouldn't reveal anything to assholes, he said with pure venom in his voice. But I know Patricia, and on Thursday, before she went to the brokers' convention, she could not snap a towel. In fact, She has never been able to snap a towel in all the time we've been married. Somebody must have taught her to do it while they were naked. So I grabbed her by the throat and choked the truth out of her. Yes. She's fucking her boss. Pete said that he went to Patricia's office to have it out with her boss, but the man was heavily protected by bodyguards. They threw him out into the parking lot. He wanted to smash the windows of the office, throw rocks at them, but the bodyguard said that if he did that, he'd land in jail, or even worse, he'd get a bullet in his head. Are they the ones who beat you up, Pete? I asked him. No, he said, dejected. I walked down the street and went into the sales office of a used car lot. I punched the first salesman who came to talk to me. The man was shocked, but he didn't get angry. He said, "Calm down, sir, calm down. There's room for negotiation." When I punched him again in the mouth, he got pissed off. He was a big guy, and he hit me in the mouth and the eye and knocked me out. When I came to my senses, Pete continued, I was lying on the couch in their office. I heard an ambulance approaching. I knew they were coming for me, so I got up and ran out. Then I came to see you. He began to weep uncontrollably. He got sick to his stomach. He was a mess. I called his wife, and in less than 10 minutes she was in the apartment. She kneeled in front of Pete and swore that she loved only him, that everything else she did was pure imbecility, and that theirs was a love that was a matter of life or death, the others were nothing. She didn't even remember them. Both of them wept to their heart's content, and of course they forgave each other. Patricia was wearing sunglasses to hide the hematoma by her right eye where Pete had hit her. Pete was left-handed. Both of them were oblivious to my presence, and when they left, they didn't even know I was there. They just walked out, leaving the door open, hugging each other. Life seemed to continue for me as it always had. My friends acted with me as they always did. We were, as usual, involved in going to parties, or the movies, or just simply chewing the fat, or looking for restaurants where they offered all-you-can-eat for the price of one meal. However, despite this pseudo-normality, a strange new factor seemed to have entered my life. As the subject who was experiencing it, it appeared to me that, all of a sudden, I had become extremely narrow-minded. I had begun to judge my friends in the same way I had judged the psychiatrist and the professor of anthropology. Who was I, anyway, to set myself up in judgment of anyone else? I felt an immense sense of guilt. To judge my friends created a mood previously unknown to me. But what I considered to be even worse was that not only was I judging them, I was finding their problems and tribulations astoundingly banal. I was the same man, they were my same friends. I had heard their complaints and renditions of their situations hundreds of times, and I hadn't ever felt anything except a deep identification with whatever I was listening to. My horror at discovering this new mood in myself was staggering. The aphorism that when it rains it pours couldn't have been more true for me at that moment in my life. The total disintegration of my way of life came when my friend Rodrigo Cummings asked me to take him to the Burbank airport. From there he was going to fly to New York. It was a very dramatic and desperate maneuver on his part. He considered it his damnation to be caught in Los Angeles. For the rest of his friends, it was a big joke, the fact that he had tried to drive across country to New York various times, and every time he had tried to do it, his car had broken down. Once, he had gone as far as Salt Lake City before his car collapsed. It needed a new motor. He had to junk it there. Most of the time, his cars petered out in the suburbs of Los Angeles. "What happens to your cars, Rodrigo?" I asked him once, driven by truthful curiosity. "I don't know," he replied with a veiled sense of guilt. And then, in a voice worthy of the professor of anthropology in his role of revivalist preacher, he said, "Perhaps it is because when I hit the road, I accelerate because I feel free. I usually open all my windows. I want the wind to blow on my face. I feel that I'm a kid in search of something new." It was obvious to me that his cars, which were always jalopies, were no longer capable of speeding, and he just simply burned their motors out. From Salt Lake City, Rodrigo had returned to Los Angeles, hitchhiking. Of course, he could have hitchhiked to New York, but it had never occurred to him. Rodrigo seemed to be afflicted by the same condition that afflicted me. An unconscious passion for Los Angeles, which he wanted to refuse at any cost. Another time, his car was in excellent mechanical condition. It could have made the whole trip with ease, but Rodrigo was apparently not in any condition to leave Los Angeles. He drove as far as San Bernardino, where he went to see a movie, The Ten Commandments. This movie, for reasons known only to Rodrigo, created in him an unbeatable nostalgia for LA. He came back and wept, telling me how the fucking city of Los Angeles had built a fence around him that didn't let him go through. His wife was delighted that he hadn't gone, and his girlfriend, Melissa, was even more delighted, although also chagrined because she had to give back the dictionaries that he had given her. His last desperate attempt to reach New York by plane was rendered even more dramatic because he borrowed money from his friends to pay for the ticket. He said that in this fashion, since he didn't intend to repay them, he was making sure that he wouldn't come back. I put his suitcases in the trunk of my car and headed with him for the Burbank airport. He remarked that the plane didn't leave until 7 o'clock. It was early afternoon, and we had plenty of time to 20 and see a movie. Besides, he wanted to take one last look at Hollywood Boulevard, the center of our lives and activities. We went to see an epic in Technicolor and Cinerama. It was a long, excruciating movie that seemed to rivet Rodrigo's attention. When we got out of the movie, it was already getting dark. I rushed to Burbank in the midst of heavy traffic. He demanded that we go on surface streets rather than the freeway, which was jammed at that hour. The plane was just leaving when we reached the airport. That was the final straw. Meek and defeated, Rodrigo went to a cashier and presented his ticket to get his money back. The cashier wrote down his name and gave him a receipt, and said that his money would be sent within 6 to 12 weeks from Tennessee, where the accounting offices of the airline were located. We drove back to the apartment building where we both lived. Since he hadn't said goodbye to anybody this time, for fear of losing face, nobody had ever noticed that he had tried to leave one more time. The only drawback was that he had sold his car. He asked me to drive him to his parents' house because his dad was going to give him the money he had spent on the ticket. His father had always been, as far back as I could remember, the man who had bailed Rodrigo out of every problematic situation that he had ever gotten into. The father's slogan was "Have no fear, Rodrigo Sr. is here." After he heard Rodrigo's request for a loan to pay his other loan, the father looked at my friend with the saddest expression that I had ever seen. He was having terrible financial difficulties himself. Putting his arm around his son's shoulders, he said, I can't help you this time, my boy. Now you should have fear, because Rodrigo Sr. is no longer here. I wanted desperately to identify with my friend, to feel his drama the way I always had, but I couldn't. I only focused on the father's statement. It sounded to me so final that it galvanized me. I sought Don Juan's company avidly. I left everything pending in Los Angeles and made a trip to Sonora. I told him about the strange mood that I had entered into with my friends. Sobbing with remorse, I said to him that I had begun to judge them. "Don't get so worked up over nothing," Don Juan said calmly. "You already know that a whole era in your life is coming to an end, but an era doesn't really come to an end until the king dies." "What do you mean by that, Don Juan?" "You are the king, and you are just like your friends. That is the truth that makes you shake in your boots. One thing you can do is to accept it at face value, which, of course, you can't do. The other thing you can do is to say, 'I am not like that, I am not like that,' and repeat to yourself that you are not like that. I promise you, however, that the moment will come when you will realize that you are like that." The unavoidable appointment. There was something that kept nagging at me in the back of my mind. I had to answer a most important letter I'd received, and I had to do it at any cost. What had prevented me from doing it was a mixture of indolence and a deep desire to please. My anthropologist friend, who was responsible for my meeting Don Juan Matus, had written me a letter a couple of months earlier. He wanted to know how I was doing in my studies of anthropology and urged me to pay him a visit. I compassed 3 long letters. On rereading each of them, I found them so trite and obsequious that I tore them up. I couldn't express in them the depth of my gratitude, the depth of my feelings for him. Rationalized my delay in answering with a genuine resolve to go to see him and tell him personally what I was doing with Don Juan Matus, but I kept postponing my imminent trip because I wasn't sure what it was that I was doing with Don Juan. I wanted someday to show my friend real results. As it was, I had only vague sketches of possibilities, which, in his demanding eyes, wouldn't have been anthropological fieldwork anyway. One day I found out that he had died. His death brought to me one of those dangerous silent depressions. I had no way to express what I felt because what I was feeling was not fully formulated in my mind. It was a mixture of dejection, despondency, and abhorrence at myself for not having answered his letter, for not having gone to see him. I paid a visit to Don Juan Matus soon after that. On arriving at his house, I sat down on one of the crates under his ramada and tried to search for words that would not sound banal to express my sense of dejection over the death of my friend. For reasons incomprehensible to me, Don Juan knew the origin of my turmoil and the overt reason for my visit to him. "Yes," Don Juan said dryly. "I know that your friend, the anthropologist who guided you to meet me, has died. For whatever reasons, I knew exactly the moment he died. I saw it." His statements jolted me to my foundations. "I saw it coming a long time ago. I even told you about it, but you disregarded what I said. I'm sure that you don't even remember it." I remembered every word he had said, but it had no meaning for me at the time he had said it. Don Juan had stated that an event deeply related to our meeting, but not part of it, was the fact that he had seen my anthropologist friend as a dying man. "I saw death as an outside force already opening your friend," he had said to me. "Every one of us has an energetic fissure, an energetic crack below the navel. That crack, which sorcerers call the gap, is closed when a man is in his prime. He had said that, normally, all that is discernible to the sorcerer's eye is a tenuous discoloration in the otherwise whitish glow of the luminous sphere. But when a man is close to dying, that gap becomes quite apparent. He had assured me that my friend's gap was wide open. "What is the significance of all this, Don Juan?" I had asked perfunctorily. "The significance is a deadly one," he had replied. The spirit was signaling to me that something was coming to an end. I thought it was my life that was coming to an end, and I accepted it as gracefully as I could. It dawned on me much later that it wasn't my life that was coming to an end, but my entire lineage. I didn't know what he was talking about. But how could I have taken all that seriously? As far as I was concerned, it was, at the time he said it, like everything else in my life. Just talk. Your friend himself told you, though not in so many words, that he was dying, Don Juan said. You acknowledged what he was saying the way you acknowledged what I said, but in both cases, you chose to bypass it. I had no comments to make. I was overwhelmed by what he was saying. I wanted to sink into the crate I was sitting on, to disappear, swallowed up by the earth. It's not your fault that you bypass things like this, he went on. It's youth. You have so many things to do, so many people around you. You are not alert. You never learn to be alert, anyway. In the vein of defending the last bastion of myself, my idea that I was watchful, I pointed out to Don Juan that I had been in life and death situations that required my quick wit and vigilance. It wasn't that I lacked the capacity to be alert, but that I lacked the orientation for setting an appropriate list of priorities. Therefore, everything was either important or unimportant to me. To be alert doesn't mean to be watchful, Don Juan said. For sorcerers, to be alert means to be aware of the fabric of the everyday world that seems extraneous to the interaction of the moment. On the trip that you took with your friend before you met me, you noticed only the details that were obvious. You didn't notice how his death was absorbing him, and yet something in you knew it. I began to protest, to tell him that what he was saying wasn't true. Don't hide yourself behind banalities, he said in an accusing tone. Stand up. If only for the moment you are with me, assume responsibility for what you know. Don't get lost in the extraneous fabric of the world around you, extraneous to what's going on. If you hadn't been so concerned with yourself and your problems, you would have known that that was his last trip. You would have noticed that he was closing his accounts, seeing the people who helped him, saying goodbye to them. Your anthropologist friend talked to me once, Don Juan went on. I remembered him so clearly that I wasn't surprised at all when he brought you to me at that bus depot. I couldn't help him when he talked to me. He wasn't the man I was looking for, but I wished him well from my sorcerer's emptiness, from my sorcerer's silence. For this reason, I know that on his last trip, he was saying thank you to the people who counted in his life. I admitted to Don Juan that he was so very right, that there had been so many details that I had been aware of, but that they hadn't meant a thing to me at the time, such as, for instance, my friend's ecstasy in watching the scenery around us. He would stop the car just to watch, for hours on end, the mountains in the distance, or the riverbed, or the desert. I discarded this as the idiotic sentimentality of a middle-aged man. I even made vague hints to him that perhaps he was drinking too much. He told me that in dire cases a drink would allow a man a moment of peace and detachment, a moment long enough to savor something unrepeatable. That was, for a fact, the trip for his eyes only, Don Juan said. Sorcerers take such a trip and, in it, nothing counts except what their eyes can absorb. Your friend was unburdening himself of everything superfluous. I confessed to Don Juan that I had disregarded what he had said to me about my dying friend, because, at an unknown level, I had known that it was true. Sorcerers never say things idly, he said. I am most careful about what I say to you or to anybody else. The difference between you and me is that I don't have any time at all, and I act accordingly. You, on the other hand, believe that you have all the time in the world, and you act accordingly. The end result of our individual behaviors is that I measure everything I do and say, and you don't. I conceded that he was right, but I assured him that whatever he was saying did not alleviate my turmoil or my sadness. I blurted out then, uncontrollably, every nuance of my confused feelings. I told him that I wasn't in search of advice. I wanted him to prescribe a sorcerer's way to end my anguish. I believed I was really interested in getting from him some natural relaxant, an organic Valium, and I said so to him. Don Juan shook his head in bewilderment. You are too much, he said. Next you're going to ask for a sorcerer's medication to remove everything annoying from you, with no effort at all on your part, just the effort of swallowing whatever is given. The more awful the taste, the better the results. That's your Western man's motto. You want results, one potion and you're cured. Sorcerers face things in a different way, Don Juan continued. Since they don't have any time to spare, they give themselves fully to what's in front of them. Your turmoil is the result of your lack of sobriety. You didn't have the sobriety to thank your friend properly. That happens to every one of us. We never express what we feel, and when we want to, it's too late because we have run out of time. It's not only your friend who ran out of time. You, too, ran out of it. You should have thanked him profusely in Arizona. He took the trouble to take you around, and whether you understand it or not, in the bus depot he gave you his best shot. But the moment when you should have thanked him, you were angry with him, you were judging him, he was nasty to you, whatever. And then you postponed seeing him. In reality, what you did was to postpone thanking him. Now you're stuck with a ghost on your tail. You'll never be able to pay what you owe him. I understood the immensity of what he was saying. Never had I faced my actions in such a light. In fact, I had never thanked anyone, ever. Don Juan pushed his barb even deeper. Your friend knew that he was dying, he said. He wrote you one final letter to find out about your doings. Perhaps unbeknownst to him, or to you, you were his last thought. The weight of Don Juan's words was too much for my shoulders. I collapsed. I felt that I had to lie down. My head was spinning. Maybe it was the setting. I had made the terrible mistake of arriving at Don Juan's house in the late afternoon. The setting sun seemed astoundingly golden, and the reflections on the bare mountains to the east of Don Juan's house were gold and purple. The sky didn't have a speck of a cloud. Nothing seemed to move. It was as if the whole world were hiding, but its presence was overpowering. The quietness of the Sonoran desert was like a dagger. It went to the marrow of my bones. I wanted to leave, to get in my car and drive away. I wanted to be in the city, get lost in its noise. You are having a taste of infinity, Don Juan said with grave finality. I know it, because I have been in your shoes. You want to run away, to plunge into something human, warm, contradictory, stupid, who cares? You want to forget the death of your friend. But infinity won't let you. His voice mellowed. It has gripped you in its merciless clutches. What can I do now, Don Juan? I asked. The only thing you can do, Don Juan said, is to keep the memory of your friend fresh, to keep it alive for the rest of your life, and perhaps even beyond. Sorcerers express, in this fashion, the thanks that they can no longer voice. You may think it is a silly way, but that's the best sorcerers can do. It was my own sadness, doubtless, which made me believe that the ebullient Don Juan was as sad as I was. I discarded the thought immediately. That couldn't be possible. Sadness, for sorcerers, is not personal, Don Juan said, again erupting into my thoughts. It is not quite sadness. It's a wave of energy that comes from the depths of the cosmos and hits sorcerers when they are receptive, when they are like radios, capable of catching radio waves. The sorcerers of olden times, who gave us the entire format of sorcery, believed that there is sadness in the universe, as a force, a condition, like light, like intent, and that this perennial force acts especially on sorcerers, because they no longer have any defensive shields. They cannot hide behind their friends or their studies. They cannot hide behind love, or hatred, or happiness, or misery. They can't hide behind anything. The condition of sorcerers, Don Juan went on, is that sadness, for them, is abstract. It doesn't come from coveting or lacking something, or from self-importance. It doesn't come from me. It comes from infinity. The sadness you feel for not thanking your friend is already leaning in that direction. My teacher, the Nagual Julian, he went on, was a fabulous actor. He actually worked professionally in the theater. He had a favorite story that he used to tell in his theater sessions. He used to push me into terrible outbursts of anguish with it. He said that it was a story for warriors who had everything and yet felt the sting of the universal sadness. I always thought he was telling it for me, personally. Don Juan then paraphrased his teacher, telling me that the story referred to a man suffering from profound melancholy. He went to see the best doctors of his day, and every one of those doctors failed to help him. He finally came to the office of a leading doctor, a healer of the soul. The doctor suggested to his patient that perhaps he could find solace and the end of his melancholy in love. The man responded that love was no problem for him, that he was loved perhaps like no one else in the world. The doctor's next suggestion was that maybe the patient should undertake a voyage and see other parts of the world. The man responded that, without exaggeration, he had been in every corner of the world. The doctor recommended hobbies like the arts, sports, etc. The man responded to every one of his recommendations in the same terms. He had done that and had had no relief. The doctor suspected that the man was possibly an incurable liar. He couldn't have done all those things, as he claimed. But being a good healer, the doctor had a final insight. "Ah!" he exclaimed. "I have the perfect solution for you, sir. You must attend a performance of the greatest comedian of our day. He will delight you to the point where you will forget every twist of your melancholy. You must attend a performance of the great Garrick." Don Juan said that the man looked at the doctor with the saddest look you can imagine and said, "Doctor, If that's your recommendation, I am a lost man. I have no cure. I am the great Garrick. The breaking point. Don Juan defined inner silence as a peculiar state of being in which thoughts were cancelled out, and one could function from a level other than that of daily awareness. He stressed that inner silence meant the suspension of the internal dialogue, the perennial companion of thoughts, and was therefore a state of profound quietude. The old sorcerers, Don Juan said, called it inner silence because it is a state in which perception doesn't depend on the senses. What is at work during inner silence is another faculty that man has, the faculty that makes him a magical being, the very faculty that has been curtailed, not by man himself, but by some extraneous influence. What is this extraneous influence that curtails the magical faculty of man? I asked. That is the topic for a future explanation, Don Juan replied, not the subject of our present discussion, even though it is indeed the most serious aspect of the sorcery of the shamans of ancient Mexico. Inner silence, he continued, is the stand from which everything stems in sorcery. In other words, everything we do leads to that stand, which, like everything else in the world of sorcerers, doesn't reveal itself unless something gigantic shakes us. Don Juan said that the sorcerers of ancient Mexico devised endless ways to shake themselves or other sorcery practitioners at their foundations in order to reach that coveted state of inner silence. They considered the most far-fetched acts, which may seem totally unrelated to the pursuit of inner silence, such as, for instance, jumping into waterfalls or spending nights hanging upside down from the top branch of a tree, to be the key points that brought it into being. Following the rationales of the sorcerers of ancient Mexico, Don Juan stated categorically that inner silence was accumulated. In my case, he struggled to guide me to construct a core of inner silence in myself, and then add to it, second by second, on every occasion I practiced it. He explained that the sorcerers of ancient Mexico discovered that each individual had a different threshold of inner silence in terms of time, meaning that inner silence must be kept by each one of us for the length of time of our specific threshold before it can work. What did those sorcerers consider the sign that inner silence is working, Don Juan? I asked. Inner silence works from the moment you begin to accrue it, he replied. What the old sorcerers were after was the final, dramatic, end result of reaching that individual threshold of silence. Some very talented practitioners need only a few minutes of silence to reach that coveted goal. Others, less talented, need long periods of silence, perhaps more than 1 hour of complete quietude, before they reach the desired result. The desired result is what the old sorcerers called stopping the world, the moment when everything around us ceases to be what it's always been. This is the moment when sorcerers return to the true nature of man, Don Juan went on. The old sorcerers also called it total freedom. It is the moment when man the slave becomes man the free being, capable of feats of perception that defy our linear imagination. Don Juan assured me that inner silence is the avenue that leads to a true suspension of judgment, to a moment when sensory data emanating from the universe at large ceases to be interpreted by the senses, a moment when cognition ceases to be the force which, through usage and repetition, decides the nature of the world. Sorcerers need a breaking point for the workings of inner silence to set in, Don Juan said. The breaking point is like the mortar that a mason puts between bricks. It's only when the mortar hardens that the loose bricks become a structure. From the beginning of our association, Don Juan had drilled into me the value, the necessity, of inner silence. I did my best to follow his suggestions by accumulating inner silence second by second. I had no means to measure the effect of this accumulation, nor did I have any means to judge whether or not I had reached any threshold. I simply aimed doggedly at accruing it, not just to please Don Juan, but because the act of accumulating it had become a challenge in itself. One day, Don Juan and I were taking a leisurely stroll in the main plaza of Hermosillo. It was the early afternoon of a cloudy day. The heat was dry and actually very pleasant. There were lots of people walking around. There were stores around the plaza. I had been to Hermosillo many times, and yet I had never noticed the stores. I knew that they were there, but their presence was not something I had been consciously aware of. I couldn't have made a map of that plaza if my life depended on it. That day, as I walked with Don Juan, I was trying to locate and identify the stores. I searched for something to use as a mnemonic device that would stir my recollection for later use. As I have told you before, many times, Don Juan said, jolting me out of my concentration, every sorcerer I know, male or female, sooner or later arrives at a breaking point in their lives. Do you mean that they have a mental breakdown or something like that? I asked. No, he said, laughing. Mental breakdowns are for persons who indulge in themselves. Sorcerers are not persons. What I mean is that at a given moment the continuity of their lives has to break in order for inner silence to set in and become an active part of their structures. It's very, very important, Don Juan went on, that you yourself deliberately arrive at that breaking point, or that you create it artificially and intelligently. What do you mean by that, Don Juan? I asked, caught in his intriguing reasoning. Your breaking point, he said, is to discontinue your life as you know it. You have done everything I told you, dutifully and accurately. If you are talented, you never show it. That seems to be your style. You're not slow, but you act as if you were. You're very sure of yourself, but you act as if you were insecure. You're not timid, and yet you act as if you were afraid of people. Everything you do points at one single spot. Your need to break all that, ruthlessly. But in what way, Don Juan? What do you have in mind? I asked, genuinely frantic. I think everything boils down to one act, he said. You must leave your friends. You must say goodbye to them, for good. It's not possible for you to continue on the warrior's path carrying your personal history with you, and unless you discontinue your way of life, I won't be able to go ahead with my instruction. Now, Don Juan, I said, I have to put my foot down. You're asking too much of me. To be frank with you, I don't think I can do it. My friends are my family, my points of reference. Precisely, he remarked. They are your points of reference. Therefore, they have to go. Sorcerers have only one point of reference: infinity. But how do you want me to proceed, Don Juan? I asked in a plaintive voice. His request was driving me up the wall. You must simply leave, he said matter-of-factly. Leave any way you can. But where would I go? I asked. My recommendation is that you rent a room in one of those chintzy hotels you know, he said. The uglier the place, the better. If the room has drab green carpet, and drab green drapes, and drab green walls, So much the better, a place comparable to that hotel I showed you once in Los Angeles. I laughed nervously at my recollection of a time when I was driving with Don Juan through the industrial side of Los Angeles, where there were only warehouses and dilapidated hotels for transients. One hotel in particular attracted Don Juan's attention because of its bombastic name, Edward VII. We stopped across the street from it for a moment to look at it. "That hotel over there," Don Juan said, pointing at it, "is to me the true representation of life on earth for the average person. If you are lucky or ruthless, you will get a room with a view of the street, where you will see this endless parade of human misery. If you're not that lucky or that ruthless, you will get a room on the inside, with windows to the wall of the next building. Think of spending a lifetime torn between those two views, envying the view of the street if you're inside, and envying the view of the wall if you're on the outside, tired of looking out." Don Juan's metaphor bothered me no end, for I had taken it all in. Now, faced with the possibility of having to rent a room in a hotel comparable to the Edward VII, I didn't know what to say or which way to go. "What do you want me to do there, Don Juan?" I asked. "A sorcerer uses a place like that to die," he said, looking at me with an unblinking stare. "You have never been alone in your life. This is the time to do it. You will stay in that room until you die." His request scared me, but at the same time, it made me laugh. "Not that I'm going to do it, Don Juan," I said, "but what would be the criteria to know that I'm dead? Unless you want me to actually die physically." "No," he said, "I don't want your body to die physically. I want your person to die. The two are very different affairs. In essence, your person has very little to do with your body. Your person is your mind, and believe you me, your mind is not yours." "What is this nonsense, Don Juan, that my mind is not mine?" I heard myself asking with a nervous twang in my voice. "I'll tell you about that subject someday," he said, "but not while you're cushioned by your friends. The criteria that indicates that a sorcerer is dead," he went on, "is when it makes no difference to him whether he has company or whether he is alone. The day you don't covet the company of your friends, whom you use as shields, that's the day that your person has died. What do you say? Are you game?" "I can't do it, Don Juan," I said. "It's useless that I try to lie to you. I can't leave my friends." "It's perfectly all right," he said, unperturbed. My statement didn't seem to affect him in the least. "I won't be able to talk to you anymore, but let's say that during our time together you have learned a great deal. You have learned things that will make you very strong, regardless of whether you come back or you stray away." He patted me on the back and said goodbye to me. He turned around and simply disappeared among the people in the plaza, as if he had merged with them. For an instant, I had the strange sensation that the people in the plaza were like a curtain that he had opened and then disappeared behind. The end had come, as did everything else in Don Juan's world. Swiftly and unpredictably. Suddenly, it was on me. I was in the throes of it, and I didn't even know how I had gotten into it. I should have been crushed. Yet I wasn't. I don't know why I was elated. I marveled at the facility with which everything had ended. Don Juan was indeed an elegant being. There were no recriminations or anger or anything of that sort at all. I got in my car and drove, as happy as a lark. I was ebullient. How extraordinary that everything had ended so swiftly, I thought, so painlessly. My trip home was uneventful. In Los Angeles, being in my familiar surroundings, I noticed that I had derived an enormous amount of energy from my last exchange with Don Juan. I was actually very happy, very relaxed, and I resumed what I considered to be my normal life with renewed zest. All my tribulations with my friends, and my realizations about them, everything that I had said to Don Juan in reference to this, were thoroughly forgotten. It was as if something had erased all that from my mind. I marveled a couple of times at the facility I had in forgetting something that had been so meaningful, and in forgetting it so thoroughly. Everything was as expected. There was one single inconsistency in the otherwise neat paradigm of my new old life. I distinctly remembered Don Juan saying to me that my departing from the sorcerer's world was purely academic, and that I would be back. I had remembered and written down every word of our exchange. According to my normal linear reasoning and memory, Don Juan had never made those statements. How could I remember things that had never taken place? I pondered uselessly. My pseudo-recollection was strange enough to make a case for it, but then I decided that there was no point to it. As far as I was concerned, I was out of Don Juan's milieu. Following Don Juan's suggestions in reference to my behavior with those who had favored me in any way, I had come to an earth-shaking decision for me. That of honoring and saying thank you to my friends before it was too late. One case in point was my friend Rodrigo Cummings. One incident involving my friend Rodrigo, however, toppled my new paradigm and sent it tumbling down to its total destruction. My attitude toward him changed radically when I vanquished my competitiveness with him. I found out that it was the easiest thing in the world for me to projectize 0% into whatever Rodrigo did. In fact, I was exactly like him, but I didn't know it until I stopped competing with him. Then the truth emerged for me with maddening vividness. One of Rodrigo's foremost wishes was to finish college. Every semester, he registered for school and took as many courses as was permitted. Then, as the semester progressed, he dropped them one by one. Sometimes he would withdraw from school altogether. At other times he would keep one 3-unit course all the way through to the bitter end. During his last semester, he kept a course in sociology because he liked it. The final exam was approaching. He told me that he had 3 weeks to study, to read the textbook for the course. He thought that that was an exorbitant amount of time to read merely 600 pages. He considered himself something of a speed reader, with a high level of retention. In his opinion, he had a nearly 0% photographic memory. He thought he had a great deal of time before the exam, so he asked me if I would help him recondition his car for his paper route. He wanted to take the right door off in order to throw the paper through that opening with his right hand instead of over the roof with his left. I pointed out to him that he was left-handed, to which he retorted that among his many abilities, which none of his friends noticed, was that of being ambidextrous. He was right about that. I had never noticed it myself. After I helped him to take the door off, he decided to rip out the roof lining, which was badly torn. He said that his car was in optimum mechanical condition, and he would take it to Tijuana, Mexico, which, as a good Angeleno of the day, he called TJ, to have a tree line for a few bucks. We could use a trip, he said with glee. He even selected the friends he would like to take. And TJ, I'm sure that you'll go to look for used books, because you're an asshole. The rest of us will go to a bordello. I know quite a few. It took us a week to rip out all the lining and sand the metal surface to prepare it for its new lining. Rodrigo had 2 weeks left to study then, and he still considered that to be too much time. He engaged me then in helping him paint his apartment and redo the floors. It took us over a week to paint it and sand the hardwood floors. He didn't want to paint over the wallpaper in one room. We had to rent a machine that removed wallpaper by applying steam to it. Naturally, neither Rodrigo nor I knew how to use the machine properly, and we botched the job horrendously. We ended up having to use topping, a very fine mixture of plaster of Paris and other substances that gives a wall a smooth surface. After all these endeavors, Rodrigo ended up having only 2 days left to cram 600 pages into his head. He went frantically into an all-day and all-night reading marathon with the help of amphetamines. Rodrigo did go to school the day of the exam and did sit down at his desk and did get the multiple-choice exam sheet. What he didn't do was stay awake to take the exam. His body slumped forward, and his head hit the desk with a terrifying thud. The exam had to be suspended for a while. The sociology teacher became hysterical, and so did the students sitting around Rodrigo. His body was stiff and icy cold. The whole class suspected the worst. They thought he had died of a heart attack. Paramedics were summoned to remove him. After a cursory examination, they pronounced Rodrigo profoundly asleep and took him to a hospital to sleep the effect of the amphetamines off. My projection into Rodrigo Cummings was so total that it frightened me. I was exactly like him. The similarity became untenable to me. In an act of what I considered to be total suicidal nihilism, I rented a room in a dilapidated hotel in Hollywood. The carpets were green and had terrible cigarette burns that had obviously been snuffed out before they turned into full-fledged fires. It had green drapes and drab green walls. The blinking sign of the hotel shone all night through the window. I ended up doing exactly what Don Juan had requested, but in a roundabout way. I didn't do it to fulfill any of Don Juan's requirements or with the intention of patching up our differences. I did stay in that hotel room for months on end, until my person, like Don Juan had proposed, died, until it truthfully made no difference to me whether I had company or I was alone. After leaving the hotel, I went to live alone, closer to school. I continued my studies of anthropology, which had never been interrupted, and I started a very profitable business with a lady partner. Everything seemed perfectly in order until one day when the realization hit me like a kick in the head that I was going to spend the rest of my life worrying about my business, or worrying about the phantom choice between being an academic or a businessman, or worrying about my partner's foibles and shenanigans. True desperation pierced the depths of my being. For the first time in my life, despite all the things that I had done and seen, I had no way out. I was completely lost. I seriously began to toy with the idea of the most pragmatic and painless way to end my days. One morning, a loud and insistent knocking woke me up. I thought it was the landlady, and I was sure that if I didn't answer, she would enter with her passkey. I opened the door, and there was Don Juan. I was so surprised that I was numb. I stammered and stuttered, incapable of saying a word. I wanted to kiss his hand, to kneel in front of him. Don Juan came in and sat down with great ease on the edge of my bed. "I made the trip to Los Angeles," he said, "just to see you." I wanted to take him to breakfast, but he said that he had other things to attend to and that he had only a moment to talk to me. I hurriedly told him about my experience in the hotel. His presence had created such havoc that not for a second did it occur to me to ask him how he had found out where I lived. I told Don Juan how intensely I regretted having said what I had in Hermosillo. "You don't have to apologize," he assured me. "Every one of us does the same thing." Once, I ran away from the sorcerer's world myself, and I had to nearly die to realize my stupidity. The important issue is to arrive at a breaking point, in whatever way, and that's exactly what you have done. Inner silence is becoming real for you. This is the reason I am here in front of you, talking to you. Do you see what I mean? I thought I understood what he meant. I thought that he had intuited or read, the way he read things in the air, that I was at my wit's end, and that he had come to bail me out. "You have no time to lose," he said. "You must dissolve your business enterprise within an hour, because 1 hour is all I can afford to wait, not because I don't want to wait, but because infinity is pressing me mercilessly. Let's say that infinity is giving you 1 hour to cancel yourself out. For infinity, the only worthwhile enterprise of a warrior is freedom. Any other enterprise is fraudulent. Can you dissolve everything in 1 hour?" I didn't have to assure him that I could. I knew that I had to do it. Don Juan told me then that once I had succeeded in dissolving everything, he was going to wait for me at the marketplace in a town in Mexico. In my effort to think about the dissolution of my business, I overlooked what he was saying. He repeated it and, of course, I thought he was joking. "How can I reach that town, Don Juan? Do you want me to drive, to take a plane?" I asked. "Dissolve your business first," he commanded. "Then the solution will come. But remember, I'll be waiting for you only for an hour." He left the apartment, and I feverishly endeavored to dissolve everything I had. Naturally, it took me more than an hour, but I didn't stop to consider this, because once I had set the dissolution of the business in motion, its momentum carried me. It was only when I was through that the real dilemma faced me. I knew then that I had failed hopelessly. I was left with no business and no possibilities of ever reaching Don Juan. I went to my bed and sought the only solace I could think of: quietude, silence. In order to facilitate the advent of inner silence, Don Juan had taught me a way to sit down on my bed, with the knees bent and the soles of the feet touching, the hands pushing the feet together by holding the ankles. He had given me a thick dowel that I always kept at hand wherever I went. It was cut to a 14-inch length to support the weight of my head if I leaned over and put the dowel on the floor between my feet, and then placed the other end, which was cushioned, on the spot in the middle of my forehead. Every time I adopted this position, I fell sound asleep in a matter of seconds. I must have fallen asleep with my usual facility, for I dreamed that I was in the Mexican town where Don Juan had said he was going to meet me. I had always been intrigued by this town. The marketplace was open 1 day a week, and the farmers who lived in the area brought their products there to be sold. What fascinated me the most about that town was the paved road that led to it. At the very entrance to the town, it went over a steep hill. I had sat many times on a bench by a stand that sold cheese and had looked at that hill. I would see people who were coming into town with their donkeys and their loads, but I would see their heads first, As they kept approaching, I would see more of their bodies, until the moment they were on the very top of the hill, when I would see their entire bodies. It seemed to me always that they were emerging from the earth, either slowly or very fast, depending on their speed. In my dream, Don Juan was waiting for me by the cheese stand. I approached him. "You made it from your inner silence," he said, patting me on the back. "You did reach your breaking point." For a moment, I had begun to lose hope. But I stuck around, knowing that you would make it. In that dream, we went for a stroll. I was happier than I had ever been. The dream was so vivid, so terrifyingly real, that it left me no doubts that I had resolved the problem, even if my resolving it was only a dream fantasy. Don Juan laughed, shaking his head. He had definitely read my thoughts. "You're not in a mere dream," he said, "but who am I to tell you that? You'll know it yourself someday that there are no dreams from inner silence, because you'll choose to know it." The measurements of cognition. The end of an era was, for Don Juan, an accurate description of a process that shamans go through in dismantling the structure of the world they know in order to replace it with another way of understanding the world around them. Don Juan made us as a teacher endeavored, from the very instant we met, to introduce me to the cognitive world of the shamans of ancient Mexico. The term cognition was, for me at that time, a bone of tremendous contention. I understood it as the process by which we recognize the world around us. Certain things fall within the realm of that process and are easily recognized by us. Other things don't and remain, therefore, as oddities, things for which we have no adequate comprehension. Don Juan maintained, from the start of our association, that the world of the sorcerers of ancient Mexico was different from ours, not in a shallow way, but different in the way in which the process of cognition was arranged. He maintained that in our world our cognition requires the interpretation of sensory data. He said that the universe is composed of an infinite number of energy fields that exist in the universe at large as luminous filaments. Those luminous filaments act on man as an organism. The response of the organism is to turn those energy fields into sensory data. Sensory data is then interpreted, and that interpretation becomes our cognitive system. My understanding of cognition forced me to believe that it is a universal process, as language is a universal process. There is a different syntax for every language, as there must be a slightly different arrangement for every system of interpretation in the world. Don Juan's assertion, however, that the shamans of ancient Mexico had a different cognitive system was, for me, equivalent to saying that they had a different way of communicating that had nothing to do with language. What I desperately wanted him to say was that their different cognitive system was the equivalent of having a different language, but that it was a language nonetheless. The end of an era meant, to Don Juan, that the units of a foreign cognition were beginning to take hold. The units of my normal cognition, no matter how pleasant and rewarding they were for me, were beginning to fade. A grave moment in the life of a man. Perhaps my most cherished unit was my academic life. Anything that threatened it was a threat to the very core of my being, especially if the attack was veiled, unnoticed. It happened with a professor in whom I had put all my trust, Professor Lorca. I had enrolled in Professor Lorca's course on cognition because he was recommended to me as one of the most brilliant academics in existence. Professor Lorca was rather handsome, with blonde hair neatly combed to the side. His forehead was smooth, wrinkle-free, giving the appearance of someone who had never worried in his life. His clothes were extremely well tailored. He didn't wear a tie, a feature that gave him a boyish look. He would put on a tie only to face important people. On my memorable first class with Professor Lorca, I was bewildered and nervous at seeing how he paced back and forth for minutes that stretched themselves into an eternity for me. Professor Lorca kept on moving his thin, clenched lips up and down, adding immensities to the tension he was generating in that closed-window, stuffy room. Suddenly, he stopped walking. He stood in the center of the room, a few feet from where I was sitting, and, banging a carefully rolled newspaper on the podium, he began to talk. "It'll never be known," he began. Everyone in the room at once started anxiously taking notes. "It'll never be known," he repeated, "what a toad is feeling while he sits at the bottom of a pond and interprets the toad world around him." His voice carried a tremendous force and finality. "So, what do you think this thing is?" He waved the newspaper over his head. He went on to read to the class an article in the newspaper in which the work of a biologist was reported. The scientist was quoted as describing what frogs felt when insects swam above their heads. This article shows the carelessness of the reporter, who has obviously misquoted the scientist, Professor Lorca asserted with the authority of a full professor. A scientist, no matter how shoddy his work might be, would never allow himself to anthropomorphize the results of his research, unless, of course, he's a nincompoop. With this as an introduction, he delivered a most brilliant lecture on the insular quality of our cognitive system, or the cognitive system of any organism, for that matter. He brought to me, in his initial lecture, a barrage of new ideas and made them extremely simple, ready for use. The most novel idea to me was that every individual of every species on this earth interprets the world around it, using data reported by its specialized senses. He asserted that human beings cannot even imagine what it must be like, for example, to be in a world ruled by echolocation, as in the world of bats, where any inferred point of reference could not even be conceived of by the human mind. He made it quite clear that, from that point of view, no two cognitive systems could be alike among species. As I left the auditorium at the end of the hour-and-a-half lecture, I felt that I had been bowled over by the brilliance of Professor Lorca's mind. From then on, I was his confirmed admirer. I found his lectures more than stimulating and thought-provoking. His were the only lectures I had ever looked forward to attending. All his eccentricities meant nothing to me in comparison with his excellence as a teacher and as an innovative thinker in the realm of psychology. When I first attended the class of Professor Lorca, I had been working with Don Juan for almost 2 years. It was a well-established pattern of behavior with me, accustomed as I was to routines, to tell Don Juan everything that happened to me in my everyday world. On the first opportunity I had, I related to him what was taking place with Professor Lorca. I praised Professor Lorca to the skies and told Don Juan unabashedly that Professor Lorca was my role model. Don Juan seemed very impressed with my display of genuine admiration, yet he gave me a strange warning. "Don't admire people from afar," he said. "That is the surest way to create mythological beings. Get close to your professor, talk to him, see what he's like as a man. Test him. If your professor's behavior is the result of his conviction that he is a being who is going to die, then everything he does, no matter how strange, must be premeditated and final. If what he says turns out to be just words, he's not worth a hoot. I was insulted no end by what I considered to be Don Juan's callousness. I thought he was a little bit jealous of my feelings for Professor Lorca. Once that thought was formulated in my mind, I felt relieved. I understood everything. "Tell me, Don Juan," I said to end the conversation on a different note, "what is a being that is going to die, really? I have heard you talk about it so many times, but you haven't actually defined it for me." "Human beings are beings that are going to die," he said. "Sorcerers firmly maintain that the only way to have a grip on our world, and on what we do in it, is by fully accepting that we are beings on the way to dying. Without this basic acceptance, our lives, our doings, and the world in which we live are unmanageable affairs." "But is the mere acceptance of this so far-reaching?" I asked in a tone of quasi-protest. "You bet your life," Don Juan said, smiling. "However, it's not the mere acceptance that does the trick. We have to embody that acceptance and live it all the way through. Sorcerers throughout the ages have said that the view of our death is the most sobering view that exists. What is wrong with us human beings, and has been wrong since time immemorial, is that without ever stating it in so many words, we believe that we have entered the realm of immortality. We behave as if we were never going to die, an infantile arrogance. But even more injurious than this sense of immortality is what comes with it. The sense that we can engulf this inconceivable universe with our minds. The most deadly juxtaposition of ideas had me mercilessly in its grip. Don Juan's wisdom and Professor Lorca's knowledge. Both were difficult, obscure, all-encompassing, and most appealing. There was nothing for me to do except follow the course of events and go with them wherever they might take me. I followed to the letter Don Juan's suggestion about approaching Professor Lorca. I tried, for the whole semester, to get close to him, to talk to him. I went religiously to his office during his office hours, but he never seemed to have any time for me. But even though I couldn't speak to him, I admired him unbiasedly. I even accepted that he would never talk to me. It didn't matter to me. What mattered were the ideas that I gathered from his magnificent classes. I reported to Don Juan all my intellectual findings. I had done extensive reading on cognition. Don Juan made us urged me, more than ever, to establish direct contact with the source of my intellectual revolution. "It is imperative that you speak to him," he said with a note of urgency in his voice. "Sorcerers don't admire people in a vacuum. They talk to them. They get to know them. They establish points of reference. They compare. What you are doing is a little bit infantile. You are admiring from a distance. It is very much like what happens to a man who is afraid of women. Finally, his gonads overrule his fear and compel him to worship the first woman who says hello to him." I tried doubly hard to approach Professor Lorca, but he was like an impenetrable fortress. When I talked to Don Juan about my difficulties, he explained that sorcerers viewed any kind of activity with people, no matter how minute or unimportant, as a battlefield. In that battlefield, sorcerers performed their best magic, their best effort. He assured me that the trick to being at ease in such situations, a thing that had never been my forte, was to face our opponents openly. He expressed his abhorrence of timid souls who shy away from interaction to the point where even though they interact, they merely infer or deduce, in terms of their own psychological states, what is going on without actually perceiving what is really going on. They interact without ever being part of the interaction. Always look at the man who is involved in a tug of war with you, he continued. Don't just pull the rope, look up and see his eyes. You'll know then that he is a man, just like you. No matter what he's saying, no matter what he's doing, he's shaking in his boots, just like you. A look like that renders the opponent helpless, if only for an instant. Deliver your blow then. One day, luck was with me. I cornered Professor Lorca in the hall outside his office. Professor Lorca, I said, do you have a free moment so I could talk to you? Who in the hell are you? He said with the most natural air, as if I were his best friend and he were merely asking me how I felt that day. Professor Lorca was as rude as anyone could be, but his words didn't have the effect of rudeness on me. He grinned at me with tight lips, as if encouraging me to leave or to say something meaningful. I am an anthropology student, Professor Lorca, I said. I am involved in a field situation where I have the opportunity to learn about the cognitive system of sorcerers. Professor Lorca looked at me with suspicion and annoyance. His eyes seemed to be two blue points filled with spite. He combed his hair backward with his hand, as if it had fallen on his face. I work with a real sorcerer in Mexico, I continued, trying to encourage a response. He's a real sorcerer, mind you. It has taken me over a year just to warm him up, so he would consent to talk to me. Professor Lorca's face relaxed. He opened his mouth and, waving a most delicate hand in front of my eyes, as if he were twirling pizza dough with it, he spoke to me. I couldn't help noticing his enameled gold cuff links, which matched his greenish blazer to perfection. And what do you want from me? He said. I want you to hear me out for a moment, I said, and see if whatever I'm doing may interest you. He made a gesture of reluctance and resignation with his shoulders, opened the door of his office, and invited me to come in. I knew that I had no time at all to waste, and I gave him a very direct description of my field situation. I told him that I was being taught procedures that had nothing to do with what I had found in the anthropological literature about shamanism. He moved his lips for a moment without saying a word. When he spoke, he pointed out that the flaw of anthropologists in general is that they never allow themselves sufficient time to become fully cognizant of all the nuances of the particular cognitive system used by the people they are studying. He defined cognition as a system of interpretation, which through usage, makes it possible for individuals to utilize, with the utmost expertise, all the nuances of meaning that make up the particular social milieu under consideration. Professor Lorca's words illuminated the total scope of my field work. Without gaining command of all the nuances of the cognitive system of the shamans of ancient Mexico, it would have been thoroughly superfluous for me to formulate any idea about that world. If Professor Lorca had not said another word to me, what he had just voiced would have been more than sufficient. What followed was a marvelous discourse on cognition. Your problem, Professor Lorca said, is that the cognitive system of our everyday world with which we are all familiar, virtually from the day we are born, is not the same as the cognitive system of the sorcerer's world. This statement created a state of euphoria in me. I thanked Professor Lorca profusely and assured him that there was only one course of action in my case: to follow his ideas through hell or high water. What I have told you, of course, is general knowledge, he said as he ushered me out of his office. Anyone who reads is aware of what I have been telling you. We parted almost friends. My account to Don Juan of my success in approaching Professor Lorca was met with a strange reaction. Don Juan seemed, on the one hand, to be elated, and on the other, concerned. "I have the feeling that your professor is not quite what he claims to be," he said. "That's, of course, from a sorcerer's point of view. Perhaps it would be wise to quit now, before all this becomes too involved and consuming. One of the high arts of sorcerers is to know when to stop. It appears to me that you've gotten from your professor all you can get from him." I immediately reacted with a barrage of defenses on behalf of Professor Lorca. Don Juan calmed me down. He said that it wasn't his intention to criticize or judge anybody, but that to his knowledge, very few people knew when to quit, and even fewer knew how to actually utilize their knowledge. In spite of Don Juan's warnings, I didn't quit. Instead, I became Professor Lorca's faithful student, follower, admirer. He seemed to take a genuine interest in my work, although he felt frustrated no end with my reluctance and inability to formulate clear-cut concepts about the cognitive system of the sorcerer's world. One day, Professor Lorca formulated for me the concept of the scientist visitor to another cognitive world. He conceded that he was willing to be open-minded and toy, as a social scientist, with the possibility of a different cognitive system. He envisioned an actual research in which protocols would be gathered and analyzed. Problems of cognition would be devised and given to the shamans I knew, to measure, for instance, their capacity to focus their cognition on two diverse aspects of behavior. He thought that the test would begin with a simple paradigm in which they would try to comprehend and retain written text that they read while they played poker. The test would escalate to measure, for instance, their capacity to focus their cognition on complex things that were being said to them while they slept, and so on. Professor Lorca wanted a linguistic analysis to be performed on the shaman's utterances. He wanted an actual measurement of their responses in terms of their speed and accuracy, and other variables that would become prevalent as the project progressed. Don Juan veritably laughed his head off when I told him about Professor Lorca's proposed measurements of the cognition of shamans. "Now, I truly like your professor," he said. "But you can't be serious about this idea of measuring our cognition. What could your professor get out of measuring our responses? He'll get the conviction that we are a bunch of morons, because that's what we are. We cannot possibly be more intelligent, faster than the average man. It's not his fault, though, to believe he can make measurements of cognition across worlds. The fault is yours. You have failed to express to your professor that when sorcerers talk about the cognitive world of the shamans of ancient Mexico, they are talking about things for which we have no equivalent in the world of everyday life. For instance, perceiving energy directly as it flows in the universe is a unit of cognition that shamans live by. They see how energy flows, and they follow its flow. If its flow is obstructed, they move away to do something entirely different. Shamans see lines in the universe. Their art, or their job, is to choose the line that will take them, perception-wise, to regions that have no name. You can say that shamans react immediately to the lines of the universe. They see human beings as luminous balls, and they search in them for their flow of energy. Naturally, they react instantly to this sight. It's part of their cognition. I told Don Juan that I couldn't possibly talk about all this to Professor Lorca, because I hadn't done any of the things that he was describing. My cognition remained the same. "Ah," he exclaimed. "It's simply that you haven't had the time yet to embody the units of cognition of the shaman's world." I left Don Juan's house more confused than ever. There was a voice inside me that virtually demanded that I end all endeavors with Professor Lorca. I understood how right Don Juan was when he said to me once that the practicalities that scientists were interested in were conducive to building more and more complex machines. They were not the practicalities that changed an individual's life course from within. They were not geared to reaching the vastness of the universe as a personal, experiential affair. The stupendous machines in existence, or those in the making, were cultural affairs, the attainment of which had to be enjoyed vicariously, even by the creators of those machines themselves. The only reward for them was monetary. And pointing out all of that to me, Don Juan had succeeded in placing me in a more inquisitive frame of mind. I really began to question the ideas of Professor Lorca, something I had never done before. Meanwhile, Professor Lorca kept spouting astounding truths about cognition. Each declaration was more severe than the preceding one and, therefore, more incisive. At the end of my second semester with Professor Lorca, I had reached an impasse. There was no way on earth for me to bridge the two lines of thought. Don Juan's and Professor Lorca's. They were on parallel tracks. I understood Professor Lorca's drive to qualify and quantify the study of cognition. Cybernetics was just around the corner at that time, and the practical aspect of the studies of cognition was a reality. But so was Don Juan's world, which could not be measured with the standard tools of cognition. I had been privileged to witness it in Don Juan's actions, but I hadn't experienced it myself. I felt that that was the drawback that made bridging those two worlds impossible. I told all this to Don Juan on one of my visits to him. He said that what I considered to be my drawback, and therefore the factor that made bridging these two worlds impossible, wasn't accurate. In his opinion, the flaw was something more encompassing than one man's individual circumstances. Perhaps you can recall what I said to you about one of our biggest flaws as average human beings, he said. I couldn't recall anything in particular. He had pointed out so many flaws that plagued us as average human beings that my mind reeled. "You want something specific," I said, "and I can't think of it." "The big flaw I am talking about," he said, "is something you ought to bear in mind every second of your existence. For me, it's the issue of issues, which I will repeat to you over and over until it comes out of your ears." After a long moment, I gave up any further attempt to remember. "We are beings on our way to dying," he said. "We are not immortal, but we behave as if we were. This is the flaw that brings us down as individuals and will bring us down as a species someday." Don Juan stated that the sorcerer's advantage over their average fellow men is that sorcerers know that they are beings on their way to dying, and they don't let themselves deviate from that knowledge. He emphasized that an enormous effort must be employed in order to elicit and maintain this knowledge as a total certainty. Why is it so hard for us to admit something that is so truthful? I asked, bewildered by the magnitude of our internal contradiction. "It's really not man's fault," he said in a conciliatory tone. "Someday, I'll tell you more about the forces that drive a man to act like an ass." There wasn't anything else to say. The silence that followed was ominous. I didn't even want to know what the forces were that Don Juan was referring to. It is no great feat for me to assess your professor at a distance, Don Juan went on. He is an immortal scientist. He is never going to die. And when it comes to any concerns about dying, I am sure that he has taken care of them already. He has a plot to be buried in, and a hefty life insurance policy that will take care of his family. Having fulfilled those two mandates, he doesn't think about death anymore. He thinks only about his work. Professor Lorca makes sense when he talks, Don Juan continued, because he is prepared to use words accurately. But he's not prepared to take himself seriously as a man who is going to die. Being immortal, he wouldn't know how to do that. It makes no difference what complex machines scientists can build. The machines can in no way help anyone face the unavoidable appointment. The appointment with infinity. The Nagual Julian used to tell me, he went on, about the conquering generals of ancient Rome. When they would return home victorious, gigantic parades were staged to honor them, displaying the treasures that they had won and the defeated people that they had turned into slaves. The conquerors paraded, riding in their war chariots. Riding with them was always a slave whose job was to whisper in their ear that all fame and glory is but transitory. If we are victorious in any way, Don Juan went on, we don't have anyone to whisper in our ear that our victories are fleeting. Sorcerers, however, do have the upper hand, as beings on their way to dying. They have someone whispering in their ear that everything is ephemeral. The whisperer is death, the infallible advisor, the only one who won't ever tell you a lie. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.